Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Alexander. I am a library associate here at Snow Isle Libraries. Thank you all for joining us for this morning's program, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Principal's Office, presented by Dr. Dowdy Abe. Before we get started, I do have a few pieces of housekeeping information to share. Your mics are muted. Please put your questions and comments into the chat window. From the chat, we will gather questions to share with our presenter at the end of the program. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible. We will also use chat to share links and information with you. Closed captioning is available for this presentation. That can be enabled by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Also, this event will be recorded for later viewing on the Snow Isle Library's YouTube channel and will be available indefinitely. So at this point, I would now like to introduce Dr. Dowdy Abe.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Allow me, please, to share my PowerPoint. All right, all good? You see that?
Looks good for me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me just begin by addressing the title of this presentation. The title of this presentation is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Principal's Office? This is, since I'm a kind of a hip hop guy, you could say that this was a sample of a previous book written by Dr. Beverly Tatum. And that one was called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Principal's Office? And that book came out in the 1990s, in the latest 1990s. And so in the last, maybe it was 5 years ago or so, she was doing Dr. Tatum was doing a tour to kind of commemorate the launch of that book. And so she stopped in Seattle, and I had a chance to speak with her and introduce her in her presentation. And one of the things that I said is I had done a kind of a warm-up workshop. And my work has been around disproportionality in terms of like discipline in schools. So I was telling her how I had sampled her title for this occasion and switched cafeteria with the principal's office. So I was like, so, okay, I was just a one-time thing. And Dr. Tatum was like, no, you need to keep that title because this is a very important question to ask. So let us say that the sample has been cleared by the original artist and for me to appropriate it and to use it moving forward. So as we begin, I want to do a little bit of local critical race theorizing, if I can put it like that. Now, here's the question. How do we make sense of an area that has a long and historic progressive racial tradition while also having some of the most pronounced law enforcement and educational disparities in the nation? So here's a historic example of what I'm talking about when I say that there's a long tradition. So Washington's African-American men voted throughout the territorial period, and the Washington Territorial Suffrage Act of 1883 briefly made it possible for Black women to cast ballots until women's suffrage was struck down by the Territorial Supreme Court in 1887. So in the 1880s, Black men and, for a time, Black women were voting, which when we think about what happened, what is the landscape of voting today around the country, it is still not easy for some people to vote in certain places. But we're talking about the 1880s when Black people were able to vote here. Another example would be the story of Barry Lawson. So let me set the stage. Barry Lawson was a 27-year-old African-American waiter who worked in the Mount Fuji Hotel in downtown Seattle. That building is actually still standing. It's on Yesler. And Barry Lawson in 1938 was in this hotel in which he worked, asleep in a chair in the lobby of this hotel in which he worked. He was spotted by 3 white Seattle police officers and approached. About an hour and a half later, Barry Lawson was pronounced dead in the hospital with a fractured skull. The 3 officers said that when they contacted Barry Lawson, he seemed to be high on something. He broke free from their grasp and flung himself down a flight of stairs, and that's how he ended up with the fractured skull. Well, the local Black community was not going for that story. And after a series of protest meetings at the mayor's office and at the chief of police's office, these three officers were suspended. Then they were fired. Then they were indicted, put on trial, found guilty, and each of them were sentenced to 20 years. Now, a few months into serving their sentence, all three of these officers were pardoned by the governor of Washington at that time. And as the final officer walked out of prison, he took responsibility for the death of Barry Lawson. Now, even though justice was ultimately not served in this case, the fact that it even went that far was certainly ahead of the racial curve, comparatively speaking, to other parts of the country. And then one other point would be the 1955 Garfield High School basketball team. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I am a graduate of Garfield High School, class of 1988. And so you see this picture here. And so what I've been able to research is that this is the first racially integrated boys basketball team to win a state championship. And now, if you think about, if anybody remembers the Denzel movie, Remember the Titans, that was based on a true story about a football team in Virginia, I believe, that was racially integrated, all kinds of strife, and if you know the movie, all kinds of strife and tension around these groups of students newly put together, goes on to win a state championship in football. But that story, that true story, took place in 1971. This here took place in 1955. So again, a bit ahead of the racial curve, comparatively speaking. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it was all good and there was no discrimination or racism. All we need to do is look at and remember the Coon Chicken Inn up there in North Seattle, I think right around Shoreline in the 1930s, and you can see the racist caricature that stood out in front of the restaurant with Coon Chicken Inn, old Sambo, with the Coon Chicken Inn written on the teeth. Okay, so I was talking about disproportionality before we started, and it's in the kind of the subtitle of the presentation. So let's look at some examples of disproportionality. So I teach a hip hop class at Seattle Central. And one of the units that we do is a unit on the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s. And here you had a situation where the legislation was saying that created what was known as the 100-to-1 rule, which meant that if you had 5 grams of crack, you would be sentenced to the same amount of prison time as someone who had 500 grams of powder. And so this was back in the 80s, but then in 2009, they wanted to even that out a little bit. And I think that number went down to maybe like 17-to-1. But that's kind of a backdrop for what I want to point out as far as disproportionality goes. So if you can see my little arrow here, we have this paragraph that starts in 2007. So let's see and take a look at it. It says in 2007, 82% of people convicted on crack possession charges were Black and 9% were white, although only about 25% of crack users are African American. So that means that 25% of the crack users accounted for 82% of people convicted in court of crack possession. That is disproportionality. A more proportionate number would be around the percentage of users that you have, around 25, or at least in that neighborhood. But 25% making up 25% of users making up 82% of people convicted sounds a lot kind of like targeted enforcement, and that the police are looking in specific places as far as who and where to arrest for crack possession. You also see it in the military. You see this headline, even in the military, Black people are punished disproportionately, report shows. And an interesting thing in this, as you get into this particular article, was talking about how some of the white commanding officers, when asked about this, were saying how they felt closer relationships with their white subordinates than they did with their black subordinates. And you'll see how that kind of comes up later in the presentation. And it certainly means that back to school shouldn't mean back to the principal's office. I think that when we get around August or so, you start to see commercials on television about back to school sales, and on the commercials, you see a bunch of happy kids running around. And certainly there is that feeling for some students, but for other students, it is a time of anxiety, of uncertainty, maybe even some fear about what this particular school year is going to bring. So let's walk it back a little bit here, just in terms of historically speaking. You can see the headline here from 2020 saying Black-White Divide in Seattle Schools Gifted Programs, Discipline Rates Among the Worst in the Nation. So we have that from 2020. Now we have a headline from 2013. Feds probing Seattle schools' treatment of Black students. And it says below, as the U.S. Department of Education investigates whether Seattle Public Schools discriminated against African-American students by disciplining them more frequently or more harshly, superintendent at the time, Jose Banda, promises to find solutions. Okay, so that was 2013. Now we go back to 2001. You can see this headline, Black students face more discipline. Black middle school students in the Seattle Public Schools are 3 times as likely to be disciplined as students in other ethnic groups, and Black high school students are twice as likely to face discipline, according to a new district analysis. And so I just want to highlight the fact that while I am talking about Seattle and using Seattle specifically, and Seattle schools specifically as an example of this issue, the problem is replicated in school districts across the country. Okay, so let's take a look at some information that is buried a little bit deeper in this particular article. So it says that while 23% of last year's high school students were Black, they accounted for 40% of those disciplined. For middle school students, 22% were Black, but they accounted for 46% of disciplinary action. No other ethnic group showed such a gap. Roughly 2/3 of the punishments at both middle and high school went to males. So not only, so there is the disproportionality again, particularly as we're looking at the middle school classification. So in middle school, 22% of the students are Black, but they account for 46% of disciplinary actions. So we can see that not only do we have an issue with race here, but the fact that 2/3 of the punishments are going to males means that there is a gender issue in play as well. So take a moment to think about this whole idea of discipline versus punishment. And I think that quite often people use these terms interchangeably. However, I look at them a little bit different. Punishment obviously is, the root word is punitive. It's designed to, make it hurt, make people feel the pain, whatever that might be. If it's physical or if it's mental or emotional. I look at discipline as so I was a kid who grew up on Sunday mornings watching first wrestling and then Kung Fu theater. And I was a big fan of like the Shaw Brothers work and, films like, One-Armed Swordsman and Shaolin Mantis and Executioners from Shaolin, all of these great movies and all this action. And inevitably the story was about how the main character had somebody taken from him or her and went out to seek revenge on those who had committed whatever crime it was. And it makes me think of discipline because so much of those movies were kind of dedicated to the training sequences and the practice time that the main character had to put in order to be ready for that big final battle. And so that's why I see discipline as a little bit different than punishment. I don't think discipline is necessarily always a bad thing. Because like I said, it has elements or aspects to it that speak to, not being disciplined as like a verb, but discipline as like the adjective, as a description that can have a more positive tone to it. Okay, so I've been walking it back from 2020 to 2013 to 2001. And let's walk it back a little bit further, because I can show you. So from that article that said Black students face more discipline in 2001, there was a discussion in the community, and then a community meeting that came as a result of the information that was found in that particular article. And so I just want to read the first sentence in this article that was covering the community meeting that was in response to the article about Black students facing more discipline. So it says, quote, "About 20 years ago, the Seattle Public Schools assigned a committee to look at why Black students were more likely than others to be suspended or expelled." This article is from 2001. It's talking about 20 years ago. So that means it goes back to the early 80s. And if in the early 80s, the district was paying attention to what was happening with discipline, that means that it was going on for much longer in order to rise to the level of importance where the district would take notice. So we're talking about multiple generations of Black families in Seattle who have had generational trauma associated with their experiences with Seattle public schools. Now, what are people being removed from class for? Well, let's think about discipline in a couple of different ways. The idea of subjective discipline versus objective discipline. I can't take credit for coming up with these terms. These are just it's just information that I dug up while researching my dissertation, which we'll get to in a moment. I would tell you the title, but the title is hella long and I always forget it. But we'll look at that in a little bit. So subjective discipline versus objective discipline. So objective discipline are things that there's not really a lot of room for interpretation. If little Jimmy is sitting in class and he walks over and punches little Bobby in the head, we can't have that. If someone brings a weapon to school, those are objective things. But subjective does leave room, in fact, for interpretation. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. But there are a couple of points that I want to make here, and what I'm using is the book Culturally Responsive Teaching by Dr. Geneva Gay. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, Dr. Gay was the chairperson of my dissertation committee, so she's like my academic mom, I call her a lot. So from this book, we can see some ethnic variations in communication style. So Dr. Gay is saying that among African Americans, the participatory interactive style of communicating is sometimes referred to as call response. It involves listening, giving encouragement, commentary, compliments, and even criticism to speakers as they are talking. Anybody that's ever been to a Black church knows what I mean. Or if you're a fan of rap music and you've ever heard or seen a rapper in concert or in performance stand up on the stage and say, "Somebody say ho," and the crowd says, "Oh, back," that's call response, okay? African Americans gain the floor or get participatory entry into conversations through personal assertiveness, the strength of the impulse to be involved, and the persuasive power of the point they wish to make, rather than waiting for an authority to grant permission. Now, according to Kochman in this research here, the discourse dynamics of European Americans are almost the exact opposite of African Americans. He says they relate to issues, and European Americans relate to issues and materials as spokespersons, not advocates, and consider the truth or merits of an idea to be intrinsic, especially if the person presenting it has been certified as an authority or expert. Thus, European Americans try to avoid or minimize opposition and dialogue, especially when members of ethnic minority groups are involved, because they assume it will be confrontational, divisive, and lead to intransigence or further entrenchment of opposing viewpoints. Since no person is privy to all the answers, the best way to cull the variety of possibilities is to ensure congeniality, not confrontation, in conversation. Okay, so we see these differences in communication styles. So consequently, African Americans are often described as verbal performers whose speech behaviors are fueled by personal advocacy, emotionalism, fluidity, and creative variety. Now, when these two varying communication styles come together in the classroom, we can see that many teachers view them negatively, view the African American style negatively as rude, inconsiderate, disruptive, and speaking out of turn, and they penalize students for them. In her book, Culture and Power in the Classroom, Antonia Darder argued that among bicultural students, quote, hierarchical socialization is then further reinforced by the fact that success or failure in school is considered an individual responsibility. When bicultural students perform poorly, it is clearly considered the student's fault. Okay, so now we're getting into the meat of what we're talking about here, and this is from the article that started off 20 years ago, Seattle Public Schools, kind of giving the range of how long this has been going on, and this is a breakdown of the items that African American students were being suspended and expelled for. So you can see that disruptive conduct is the most frequent reason. What else do we have? We have fighting, we have disobedience, we have assault, we have rule breaking, and at the other end of the spectrum, burglary, robbery, bomb threats, pulling false alarms accounted for 0.01%. So let's focus on what we have up here. And we're going to divide these listed offenses under what I was talking about earlier with regard to subjective versus objective discipline. Okay, so if we start with disruptive conduct, the most frequently cited reason, I am going to file that under subjective discipline. Okay, fighting, following at 16.9%, fighting we will call objective discipline. Disobedience at 16.7%, I will call disobedience subjective. Assault at 7%, I will call objective. And rule breaking at 7%, I'm going to call rule breaking subjective, because I have been walked into classrooms that had so many rules on the wall that I was breaking at least 3 of them as soon as I walked through the door. So now let's look at this and do some numbers. So we have disruptive conduct accounting for 29%, okay? We have disobedience at 16%, and we have rule breaking at 7%. The total for the subjective types of discipline that we're looking at, disruptive conduct, disobedience, rule breaking, disruptive conduct 29%, disobedience 16%, rule breaking 7%. Now, I didn't major in math at any point in my life, but it looks like 29 plus 16 plus 7 is more than 50. So that means that above 50% of the reasons these African American students are being suspended and expelled fall underneath the subjective category. Now, am I saying that none of these students are being disruptive, or none of these students are being disobedient, or none of these students are breaking rules? Certainly, I'm not saying that. However, again, when these numbers rise above 50% of the reasons why these students are being removed from class and from school, it's enough for me to start asking questions. And it doesn't just start or end with students, rather. What we have here is a breakdown of the teachers in Seattle Public Schools. And you can see that white teachers make up the greatest number, and Asian teachers, American Indian, Native American, Latinx, African American, and 2 or more races. And this is the rating. What percentage of these teachers were rated unsatisfactory in terms of their job performance evaluation? Only 160 African American teachers, and yet almost 6% of them rated as unsatisfactory. Again, disproportionality in play. And if you're going to tell me that students in schools are not aware of how the adults in schools are treating each other or how they relate to each other, I would say that you're not giving students and young people enough credit for their observation skills. So what are some student responses here? Well, let me take a moment to talk about the notion of academic self-esteem and cool pose. And academic self-esteem is really just the way in which students view themselves, like thinking like, am I smart? Do I belong? Is school for me? Am I college material? The way that students view themselves. And then cool pose. Cool pose is actually something that we talk about in the hip hop class before we even get to anything rap music or breakdance related. It's the notion of cool pose, and this idea comes from a book called Cool Pose, and the subtitle is the Dilemmas of Black Manhood in America. Cool pose is a ritualized form of masculinity that entails behaviors, scripts, physical posturing, impression management, and carefully crafted performances that deliver a single critical message: pride, strength, and control. And so this is the idea that like everything could be going to hell in my life around me, but you'll never know that because I wear the mask all the time. It has never served Black people well to get emotional, at least in public. And so you see just it's why hip hop never smiles. You see pictures of rappers, they're never smiling. You know what I mean? Because cool pose is in full effect. And so, however, when generally speaking, when academic self-esteem goes down, cool pose starts to rise up. And I think that a lot of teachers, quite frankly, will look at the cool pose and mistake it for not caring. That kid, is not doing well and they're shut down, not even really caring about their education. They probably come from a household and from a family also that doesn't care for education. And these issues can start. Well, so I did my research on grades 4 through 8, because that is right just on the precipice of coming into middle school, and it's where the research shows that the achievement gap begins to reveal itself. However, in the time since, there has been new research that shows that these issues in terms of disproportionate discipline begin much earlier than middle school or even 4th grade. How much earlier? Well, as you can see here, the headline, Black preschoolers are far more likely to be suspended. And when I read this headline for the first time, I was like, what the hell? What are you going to be suspending a preschooler for? Well, I was giving this presentation to a parent night at a local elementary school here in Seattle. And afterward, a woman walked up to me, and I was talking about this. So she walked up to me, she was like, well, I have experience with that. This woman had a Black daughter in preschool. She walked up to me, she was like, my daughter was suspended from preschool. What was she suspended for? Well, for not taking a nap. Now, that may seem crazy, and it is crazy, but when you think about how, first of all, how teachers talk, and even how this little girl may not be very excited about the preschool that she goes to. And she has now discovered maybe she would rather be home with her mother and maybe new little baby brother or something. She has now figured out a way to get out of this environment that she feels unattached to. And the way that teachers talk and the way that school files often can follow students around like arrest records. You have a kindergarten teacher that's looking at the file of this girl and seeing that she's been suspended for a number of times. And it is not a stretch to think how that kindergarten teacher can now project negative expectations on this incoming kindergartner. And it starts so early. That thinking about how young people are eventually worn down by negative expectations like this and how it leaves them feeling. I also did a presentation about this to it was called Leadership. It was an LLD, Leadership and Learning Day, and it was every principal, professional development, every principal from every school in the Seattle School District, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, alternative schools. Every principal was in there, and I was talking about this. And so one of the principals afterward, he's telling me about how they did a student survey in his building. And from this student survey, one of the items said, if I am not at school, there will be an adult who misses me. After they got their results and kind of disaggregated all the information, this principal found that 80% of the Black students in his school answered no to this point. 80%. 80% of them felt like if they were not in school, there would not be an adult who missed them. So I was talking about earlier about not feeling seen and not feeling valued and how early and easily that can come up in young people. So now I'm thinking about how is the district figuring on kind of counteracting this? Or do they have information in their literature that kind of speaks to this? And so going through one of the Seattle Public Schools, maximizing instructional time by supporting the whole child, some of the things they had in there was student rights and responsibilities. And ironically, one student right they have listed there is to be known and cared for at school. 80% of the people in that principal's building did not feel that way. They did not feel like that was a right that they were entitled to. A student responsibility they have listed in this same document. Share with a trusted adult at the school when they are experiencing emotional and or physical stressors for the purpose of obtaining resources or support. I agree that we would love students to advocate for themselves in that way, but that's a pretty big ask for one of those 80% of students in that building who didn't feel anybody would miss them. Who is a trusted adult? If they don't feel there will be any adults missing them when they're not there, who's going to be that trusted adult they can go to? Another student responsibility, advocate for their educational, cultural, social, and emotional needs. Again, we like that. That sounds good on paper. But if these students are feeling disempowered to the extent that they don't feel like any adults are paying attention to them or them even being there, how are they going to advocate for themselves in this way? Okay, so some strategies. One thing that I really dislike is when people say, I don't see color. First of all, I'm not sure I buy that. We see color just like we see height, just like we see gender, just like we see clothing appearance, just like we see weight, just like we see all of these aspects that make people who we are. So saying you don't see color is like I said, it's at best it's naive, at worst it's disingenuous. And secondly, to try to come with that argument is a completely privileged position to come from, because historically speaking, people of color have had to see color as a matter of survival. Seattle Public Schools came with a new policy of eliminating out-of-school suspension for willful defiance, is what they're calling it. And that essentially equals the subjective discipline that we were talking about. And it's the whole idea of out of school versus out of seat time. Now, the Oakland Public Schools, when they enacted this policy, went immediately K through 12. My problem with, and I consulted a little bit on this as SPS was putting this together, was that starting at 5 is ignoring the research that says that biggest gap, not only is it the achievement gap that starts to reveal itself around the beginning of middle school, but the discipline gap. And so not having this policy in effect where the curve or the beginnings of that curve are rooted seems like a little bit nonsensical to me, but what do I know? I'm just a consultant. Here we are. So this is the title of my dissertation. And it was the effects of non-traditional instruction on the classroom discipline of African-American students grades 4 through 8. Now, when I started this research, I figured that I already knew what the answers were going to be. And my feeling was that relevant curriculum, curriculum that speaks to the lives of the students that you're working with would be one. And it was. And I figured that engaging instructional methods so that it's not just the whole, Bueller, Bueller, that's a little bit of an age specific joke, but if you've ever, or reference rather, but if you've seen the movie Ferris Bueller, and one of the teachers at Ferris's high school was just dry. Kids were asleep in the class and was just dry as desert sand. So engaging instructional methods, yes, was another one. But these two factors finished second and third, far behind the number one factor around keeping students in the classroom and out of the principal's office. Here is where I would usually, if we were live, I would point around the room and say if anybody has what they think this item is. But since we're remote, I will just share it with you. Personal relationships. And I think that maybe intuitively, I knew that, but it is important to explicitly state the importance of relationships. And I have teachers all the time who are like, well, of course I have relationships with my students. I'm with them 5 days a week for however many hours a day. And I'm like, it's got to be a little bit more intentional than that. It's not just a thing where you know their name and, maybe what their favorite lunch item is. We're talking about something a little bit more in depth that makes a student feel like this teacher is really interested in knowing me and knowing, what's important to me and what I value and what scares me and these types of things. So here's where sometimes where the live presentation gets a little uncomfortable. Because in the book, Culturally Responsive Teaching, that I was referencing earlier, Dr. Gay described a traditional way of women's communication as, quote, focusing on individuals and establishing friendships, networks, intimacy, and relationships more than exhibiting power, accomplishment, or control. So, given that roughly 90% of teachers in Washington State are women, an uncomfortable question emerges. If research suggests that, as it just did, female communicative discourse is primarily relationship-based, then what exactly is preventing these teachers from creating meaningful connections with the students who are being removed from their classroom? Well, let me talk a little bit about the notions of, and the titles, sympathetic destroyers versus warm demanders. Sympathetic destroyers, so you can see here, the headline, leading professor contends that many teachers are sympathetic destroyers of Black boys' dreams. And basically a sympathetic destroyer is someone who may not be overtly biased or prejudiced, but is either unwilling or unable to form connections that are necessary in order to promote positive, healthy educational outcomes, not just for Black students, but for all students. These things that I'm talking about here, yes, they are important for Black students, but they are generalizable in terms of helping all students be successful. That whole relationship piece, that is something that all students can benefit from. So sympathetic destroyers, and I would say that sympathetic destroyers have overrun traditionally schools today. So then what is a warm demander? A warm demander is, and I'm going to quote this, you can see the highlighted portion. This is also from Dr. Gay's book. So this original research was done with Eskimo and Indian students. And so the description of warm demanders, warm demanders created classroom climates of emotional warmth, consistently and clearly demanded high quality academic performance, spent time establishing positive interpersonal relationships between themselves and students, and among students, extended their relationships with and caring for students beyond the classroom, and communicated with students through nonverbal cues such as smiles, gentle touch, teasing, and establishing a kinesthetic feeling of closeness. So everything that a warm demander does in the classroom has a foundation of love, compassion, respect, and empathy. And you can also be, as it says here early in the quote, you can still be a warm demander and demand high quality academic performance. These two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think that frequently people who want to try to challenge on this say that you can't you can't teach in the style of a warm demander and still have academic rigor and high quality academic performance, which is nonsense. And there's some of these negative expectations that are projected and lead to the whole passive oppression in education is one of the things that's fueling the achievement gap. And I think that when we talk about the projection of negative expectations, this type of thing moves out of education and into society. And I think it's one of the reasons that we saw a few years ago this kind of rash, not that it was anything new, but it was making headlines of white Americans calling the police on Black people for just being Black in public spaces. I'm thinking of the black man who was walking his dog in Central Park, I want to say it was. Now, a woman called the police on him for, I guess, walking his dog in Central Park. There was a Black student at maybe Yale who was taking a nap in a commons area. Had the police called on her. Two Black dudes waiting in Starbucks for a meeting who were handcuffed. So that's what I'm saying about the projection of these negative expectations and the consequences that they have not only within education, but in society at large. Speaking of expectations, I want to talk a little bit about an experiment. It's called Pygmalion in the Classroom. So this was a 1965 experiment in a public elementary school. The teachers were told that certain children could be expected to be growth spurters based on the students' results on the Harvard test of inflected acquisition. What a great sounding test. In reality, there was no such test, and those children designated as spurters were chosen at random. The researchers hoped to determine the degree, if any, to which teacher changes in expectation produce changes in student achievement. So remember that this is the students who are identified as spurters were chosen at random. There was no such test as this Harvard test of inflected acquisition. And the teachers are told that you can expect these students to be growth spurters. Now, anybody want to take a guess at what happened with those students who were chosen, who were identified to the teachers to be spurters? They spurted. They did in fact spurt. Now, here's the interesting part. In their observations of the classroom dynamics, these researchers found that the teachers were not spending more time with these growth spurters. They were spending the same amount of time with the growth spurters, essentially, as they were spending with other students in the class who were not supposed to be growth spurters. So what does that tell us? That tells us that it is not so much about the quantity of time that a teacher spends with a student, but about the quality of the interaction that really makes the difference. Something that also speaks to this dynamic is from an analysis of Native Americans at the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon. Many of the achievement problems of the students in this study derived from the interactional and procedural protocols of teaching, rather than the substantive content of what was taught. How teachers talked to students interfered more with their academic engagement than the topics being discussed. Now, it's important to remember that just being a person of color is not an automatic qualifier to being effective with students of color or in a diverse classroom. Just in the same way that being a white teacher is not an automatic disqualifier to be effective in diverse classrooms. Regular professional introspection and reflection is necessary for us all, but especially people in those gatekeeper occupations. And for the purposes of this discussion, teachers are one of those, as well as police officers. And I had an opportunity to do some work with the Criminal Justice Training Commission to develop some curriculum around the history of race and policing for recruits, cadets coming in, new police recruits coming in for their training, and even introduce the idea of culturally responsive policing. That work is still underway. Early on in my career, when I was teaching, I taught kids in the 1990s at a small, predominantly African-American school called Zion Preparatory Academy. Early on in my career there, I was told I would have to decide, am I a teacher who's Black or a Black man who's a teacher? At first, I was a little uncertain what that meant. But over time, to me, this has come to mean that if I'm a teacher who's Black, and this also applies for police officers, if I'm a teacher who's Black, then like I go to work, you know, I want people to do well, but I'm not really that invested in it. You know, it's not something I take home with me. You know, the feeling, the vibe that I give off to my colleagues and my students is that I'm really just kind of there to collect a check. Okay, but if I'm a Black man who's a teacher, then I'm being conscientious of the fact that I realize that I am entering into an institution, that being education, that has traditionally had negative outcomes for students that look like me. And what am I going to do to try to minimize or mitigate those negative outcomes? Being conscientious and trying to apply that conscientiousness to the work that you're doing every day. Because we certainly know that the school to prison pipeline is a very real thing. And I have to say that I also gave this presentation to the Black Prisoners Caucus out at the state penitentiary in Monroe. And afterward, man, about a dozen of these cats came and got at me and was like, yo, these subjective types of disciplinary things that started to hit me around middle school were really the first steps in me being locked down here. So that's a very real dynamic in the lives of some of these people. And we know that when Black students drop out of school, the likelihood that they will have interactions with the criminal justice system skyrockets. And we see examples. This is an example of a student, I want to say maybe in South Carolina, of a Black girl. She was a high school student. She was sitting in class, she was being belligerent. She was being asked to leave the class. She was just staring at her phone and ignoring the teacher. They bring in the school resource officer, and the officer body slams this girl in her desk and drags her out of the room. We see an example in Florida of a 6-year-old who hit a couple of staff members and was subsequently handcuffed. Okay, this is the criminalization of non-criminal behavior happening in schools. And this is not just a K through 12 thing. In the early 2010s, data came out from Seattle Central College, saying that Black male students were the least retained population on campus. Now, so what we did is we put together this was actually a research project. So we put together this program, it's called The Village. And what we did, we met bi-weekly every other week with this group of Black male students. And we had, speakers come in, and we had, we had food because, you can build community. You can always build community around food. We had speakers come in from like the registration office or from like financial aid. And so that when these students in particular had issues around those things, because what student doesn't need to visit the financial aid office or the registration office at some point, that they were able to put a face with these officers, which can be, if you do not have a lot of educational capital in your background, which can be intimidating places. And so we were able to statistically highlight the fact that Black male students who participated in the village had higher rates of retention than those who did not. And so if you look over here on the left and kind of some of the themes that emerged from this project, you can see that that they are very similar to a lot of what we've been talking about so far today. Community, resources, empowerment, validation, fellowship are all things that students who are struggling in K through 12 can benefit from in the same way that students who are in college, the needs can also be met for those college students. Now, I'm currently involved in a program called the Academy for Rising Educators, and that's a grow your own teacher certification program. I'm the faculty coordinator, so my job is to find instructors to teach these classes. And it's a partnership between Seattle Public Schools and Seattle Central, where we take employees of Seattle Public Schools. The vast majority of them have been IAs, instructional assistants, who are already working in the schools, as well as some graduating high school students who are able to take advantage of the Seattle Promise program, which guarantees 2 years of paid tuition at one of the Seattle colleges for high school students that graduate, Seattle high school students that graduate. And we've had four cohorts come through, and where we use language like warm demanders. The goal is to produce of ARE is to produce warm demanders and flood the schools with them if we can. And we have this picture here, you can see was from our first graduation. And here's the mission statement. The Academy for Rising Educators produces diverse, homegrown practitioners who are culturally responsive, employ anti-racist, relationship-based, student-centered pedagogy, and engage in critical community discourse. Now, one of the things that some people seem to have issue with is, how do we discuss these types of things with young people? If there are preschoolers who are being disproportionately disciplined, some people, I've heard them, had people argue this to me. Some people are going to say, well, some of these kids are just too young to really understand what it is that's going on. You're not going to be able to talk to younger kids about race and about disproportionality and about oppression and things like that. To that, I respond with this example. And this example, you can see it is a cartoon. And it's a cartoon. You can see in the cartoon, you have a sheriff there who appears to be obstructing, and you have a Black soldier standing there, and you can see the sign on the building there, Alabama County, no Negro voting permitted, off limits. And the caption is the soldier saying to this officer blocking his way, I'm only on my way to save democracy in Vietnam. Now, some of the questions down below, start off, okay, how many children like cartoons? But then, what does the sign say? What do the signs say? Who are the two men in the picture? And if you kind of go down a little bit further, you can see, what does democracy mean? What does the soldier mean by saving democracy? So this is from 1965, because referencing the Vietnam War. Where is Alabama? What does off limits mean? Are Afro-Americans able to enjoy all rights of our democracy everywhere in the US? Why? Why not? Where? Where is Vietnam? And one of the bottom questions here is why do you think Black soldiers are fighting in Vietnam for democracy if they are denied democracy at home? So these are questions. Using the cartoon is great because it draws young people and kids in. But these questions are really kind of getting at the heart of what we've been talking about here, of things like disproportionality, of things like oppression, of things like being able to enjoy full rights. So what then do we think, what level then do we think that this particular lesson item was intended for? Well, I'll tell you. Kindergarten, grades 1 and 2. So that means we're talking about this lesson being presented to 5, 6, 7-year-olds. Okay, and so I'm saying that if children in preschool are young enough to experience the type of dynamics that have negative effects on their chances of going to school. I mean, look, I'm the first person to say that college isn't for everybody, and that's okay. But that decision of whether or not to go to college need not be made for these students before they even get to high school. Okay, and so if they are young enough to experience these dynamics, then certainly they are young enough to have critical, constructive dialogue about what these dynamics are, where they come from, and what effects they can have on the lives, outcomes, and ultimate happiness of the students that we are all supposed to be lifting up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abe. At this time, we'll open the floor for comments or questions. We have received none up to this point, though we'll give a moment if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, that they would like Dr. Abe to respond to. Encourage you to put those into the chat, and we can relay those on to him. As I say, we'll give a moment because we realize that it can take a little bit longer to type than to chat. So we appreciate your patience, but we'll see if there is anything that we would like to hear more detail on.
Yeah, this sometimes happens. I realized that was a pretty dense presentation, so I understand.
Yeah, looks like we do have one comment and question that has been posted here. Quote, first, I want to thank Dr. Abe and Snow Isle Libraries for making space for this talk. As someone who does not have school-aged children, how can I and others support Black kids in school?
That's an interesting question. I think it is always possible to volunteer. I think that volunteering and being very intentional about how you present yourself as a volunteer in whatever school you go to is the key. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about warm demanders, and it is completely possible for a volunteer to come in and model the warm demander approach to the young people that they're working with in whatever school they're volunteering in. And so, you know, making sure that you are not bringing any of that sympathetic destroyer energy into the classroom or into the school, and making sure that you're leaning more into, because like I said, and so much of that warm demander piece is about relationships. And so getting into the school, interacting with young people, but forming authentic relationships. We all know, if we think back on our lives and think about the relationships that were successful and perhaps the relationships that were not, we can see that the relationships were successful were the relationships that we invested time in, invested emotion in, made sure that we were being authentic and showing up for the person involved in that relationship. And so that would be just one thing that jumps into my head. But like I said, we don't want sympathetic destroyer volunteers in school. We already have enough of them manning the classrooms and being, being the teacher. So that would be my suggestion. But being very intentional about that volunteering and making sure that the relationship aspect is being put to the forefront when you get in there and when you start having contact with these young people.
Thank you very much for that response.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, we are seeing a couple other comments of general appreciation of support and even some recognition of some of the other studies that had been done, especially when you were speaking of the experiment that was conducted with growth spurters, with another similar study with or activity of dividing kids in classroom, brown eyes, blue eyes, as a way to further represent how that could look to a younger audience.
Right. And if we think about, a lot of people subscribe to that old maxim about success being a function of expectation. Well, then if that's the case and you believe in that, then the inverse would also be true, is that failure can also be a function of expectation.
Well, thank you very much. As I'm seeing no further questions, at this point, I will go ahead and begin bringing this presentation to a close. Sorry, just seeing another final comment in here. Want to make sure that if there is a question involved, that it is addressed. Yeah, I think just as a teacher of elementary students, this comment is for 33 years, now retired. I see the role as warm demander as a valuable way to interact and relate to all people everywhere. I think it sounds like there is some familiarity, at least with the concept. So thank you for, spending some time further delving into it and providing this much more succinct and all-encompassing title for.
And
a
I
way
would
that we
say
can interact with
that
students.
you can be a warm demander and just about anything that you do. That type of thing. If we're saying that kindness is something that seems to be in short supply these days, that empathy is something that seems to be empathy and compassion are things that seem to be in short supply these days, in whatever line of work you're in, or even if you're just not even in work, but just how you go about your day and treating people. I mean, I think that this approach, this warm demander approach, is generalizable in many different scenarios, not just education.
Indeed. Well, with that, we want to thank you, Dr. Abe, and thank you everyone for attending and listening in to this presentation. You will be able to find a recording of this presentation posted to the Snow Isle Library's YouTube channel in the next several days. Do be sure to check the Snow Isle Library's website for more online events, including Black Love Matters, Real Talk on Romance, Being Seen, and Happily Ever Afters, presented by Jessica Pride on the evening of February 8th. Have a great day. We hope to see you again soon.